Okay, wonderful. So in the last lecture, we talked about some of the reasons that competitive markets might not be efficient, right? We said that in circumstances where one person or entity has the ability to change the price, they'll do so in a way that benefits them and breaks output efficiency, right? Monopolies will produce less than they ought to produce. We said that in circumstances where my actions might have either a positive or negative effect on other people that I don't take into account, I'll do too much of the things that hurt other people and not enough of the things that help other people. And we said that when someone has access to private information, they might use that information to lie to or manipulate other people to their benefit. And as a result, we might have a collapse in trust and a race to the bottom in terms of quality. And all of those are important problems, right? That describe a lot of the problems we see in our society. But a lot of the problems that many people identify with the way that our society is organized, right? If you want to call our society something like a market economy, a lot of the problems don't really fit into that framework. If we think about, for example, the question of why a tech mogul rented an apartment for his daughter's cats when we've got 40,000 people sleeping in the street, right? And ask the question, is that an efficient allocation of housing space? It's hard to think about the failure there. If we think that that is a failure, it's hard to think about the failure there as being a result of externalities or market power or information asymmetry, right? Tech mogul doesn't really have any ability to change prices in the LA rental market, and the LA rental market is fairly competitive. Maybe there's an externality story, right? Maybe if we thought about all the benefits to everyone other than a homeless person, of putting that homeless person in housing, we'd think that landlords ought to be subsidizing housing for homeless, or homeless people ought to be spending more of their income on housing. But most of the benefits that we think about coming to a person getting housed go to that person himself, right? So it's hard to think about it exactly as fitting there. And maybe it's information asymmetry to some degree, right? Maybe we can think that homeless people who make really good tenants are still not going to be offered housing because landlords can't tell the difference between homeless people who make good tenants and homeless people who don't, and so treat every homeless person as if they're going to be a bad tenant. There's some plausibility to that story too. But the real fundamental issue here is much, much simpler than that, right? Much simpler than any of those stories. The fundamental issue here is that the tech mogul just has vastly more resources than a homeless person in LA, right? He's vastly, vastly richer. And so as a result, he might have an actual higher dollar value in terms of his willingness to pay for an apartment than a homeless person, even when that apartment is just going to his daughter's cats, right? A relatively trivial expenditure for him, right, or a relatively trivial problem to solve with housing could be worth many more dollars to him than a crucial, fundamental human need is for someone with very, very low incomes, right? This might be the same reason that we would see that, expenditures on malaria are less than the expenditures in the Avenger movie. It's because people like me who want to go see the Avenger movie have vastly higher incomes than people who are suffering from malaria. And so if that's the case, right, we might not actually argue that this outcome of the apartment going to the tech entrepreneur's cats, that outcome might not be inefficient, right? If we drew an Edgeworth box, entrepreneur, I should really call him mogul, I'm not sure if he started his own thing, versus the homeless person, and we drew a contract curve, right, for let's say housing and everything else. Right, we might have actually been on our contract curve. It's just, we were just about here. Right, we were at a point on our contract curve where the tech mogul got vastly more of everything that he values than the homeless person, right? So there might not be gains to trade here. It might not be that there's something that a homeless person in LA could offer that tech mogul that would be worth more to him than his apartment, right? They might not be able to have a mutually beneficial exchange. But our sense that an injustice is being done here doesn't have to do with a missed opportunity for a mutually beneficial exchange, right? Our sense that an injustice is being done here has to do with the distribution of resources. It has to do with the fact that some people have vastly more than other people. And so for many people, right, for many of us, our conception of social justice or social welfare or the proper functioning of an economy goes way beyond Pareto efficiency, right? It's not enough to say you can't make one person better off without making someone else worse off. We also are going to care something about how well off everyone is, right? We might want to have some sense not just of efficiency, but also of equity. We might want to think not just about efficiency, but something like social welfare or social justice. So what do we mean by that? What are we talking about if we want to talk about something like social welfare? Well, at some level, at a really, really simple level, right? All we're saying is that instead of just thinking about what's good or bad for a particular person, right? Whether I would be happier with more beefaroni and less water, whether I would be happier with more froyo and less topping. We want to talk about what's good or bad for everyone, right? What's good or bad for society as a whole. In a more particular way, in a more concrete way, what this means is needing to balance the interests of different people against each other. In other words, it's not enough to say, right, that the value of housing versus whatever else you can buy with $1 is equal for the tech mogul, right? We don't need to just compare his MRS to the price ratio. We want to be able to say something about how much one individual is benefiting from accessing a resource relative to how much some other individual is benefiting from access to that resource. And we want to talk about how we value individuals relative to each other. Okay, so first of all, I want to warn you, right? I'm writing some checks I can't cash here, right? We're opening up some of the biggest and deepest questions that a human being can think about, and I'm going to try to get through it in the next, let's say, 7 to 9 minutes to keep you guys from going way along today on today's lecture. So we're going to barely scratch the surface of all the ways that we could potentially conceptualize social welfare or social justice. But I do want to talk to you about a couple of really important schools. The first of which is what's called utilitarian philosophy or utilitarianism. The fundamental idea of utilitarianism, the basic premise of utilitarianism, is that the way we should understand what's best for society, the way we should define social welfare, is by essentially adding up the well-being of every individual in society, right? So our goal as a society should be the most happiness for the most number, right? The most total happiness, the least total pain. So Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher who's usually considered the founder of utilitarianism, essentially said, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do. So if you're utilitarianism, right, your idea of social welfare is that the welfare of society, right, let's say a society that has two people, you and Maud, is just going to be the utility that you get from, let's say, your water and your beefaroni, and the utility that Maud gets, like, right, plus the utility that Maud gets. Right? We add up both of your well-beings, and we get to society's well-being. So on the surface, this looks really simple, right? Great. Let's call it a day, right? We've got a nice, easy, clean answer to this question of how to define social welfare. But if we think about what we've said about utility functions in the past, we think about what we have to say to write this becomes enormously challenging. Because remember, up until now, we've always defined utility functions by saying that the numbers themselves don't matter, they're just a way of labeling indifference curves. All a utility function can tell us is better or worse, right? So if I wanted to draw your indifference curves for beefaroni and water, right, different combinations of beefaroni and water, it would be exactly the same thing, exactly the same thing. If I did this by saying that this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3, versus saying this is 1, this is 2,000, and this is 3 million. Right? These two functions are going to have enormously different implications on the question of how we value your well-being versus Maud's, right? When we want to think about utilitarian philosophy, we have to take this incredibly strong stance that we can say objectively, how much better off you are by consuming an extra bit of water, right? Because that's the only way that we can say that we're better off giving the water to you than giving the water to Maud. So Bentham, right, the founder of utilitarian philosophy, spent the end of his life actually trying to do this, actually trying to say, I'm going to write down something like a utility function for everyone, right? An objective dictionary of pleasure and pain. So he sat there in his office and did things like pricked himself with a finger and said, oh, that's a -1, right? Stick my hand in the fire. Oh, -10. Eat a scoop of ice cream, right? +8. Read a philosophical treatise. That's +23 for anybody, right? Have my heart broken. Oh no, -50, right? He was actually trying to sit down and think about how we can weigh all of the different experiences a human being can have in order to be able to say, in an objective sense, in a reasonable sense, what we as a society should strive for. That's an insane thing to do. It's an utterly insane thing to do. But it is absolutely necessary if we want to do this, right? If we want to be able to define our social welfare by adding up the welfare of every individual. So another thing I want you to note is that this utilitarian social welfare function doesn't in its heart say anything specific about inequality, right? We're just as happy if you have 1,000,000 utils and Maud has -100 utils than if each of you have, 499,950 utils, right? It doesn't matter how we're distributing utility between the individuals. But in practice, utilitarian social welfare tends to argue in favor of relatively equal, not immensely equal, but relatively equal distributions of wealth. Because we believe that when we write down objective utility functions like this, people have objectively diminishing marginal returns to consumption. In other words, that the first little bit of beefaroni, the first little bit of water, is more wonderful to you, brings you more pleasure than the 100th, right? When Bentham is sitting there in his office, his first scoop of ice cream is going to make him happier, it's going to have a higher notation in his logbook than his 50th scoop of ice cream. So we'll end up with utility functions that look something like this, right? Where if I double or triple or quadruple all of my inputs, I get less than double or less than triple or less than quadruple of my outputs. Essentially all we're saying here is the work we've done with producer theory, right, where we talk about returns to scale and that mattering for consumers too. Utilitarian philosophy is going to argue in favor of diminished inequality when people have diminishing returns to scale in consumption. There's one little cynical variant of utilitarian philosophy that I want to talk to you about before we move on from this, which comes from Wilfred Pareto. Wilfred Pareto being the person who invented the idea of Pareto optimality, and who, I wrote this up in the lecture notes, but I don't think I said it before, started his life as an anarchist, ended his life as a fascist. Very interesting, very weird man. He argued that this is all well and good, but it really doesn't capture what we seem to value as a society. It doesn't capture how things are really distributed. Because in real life, we don't value everyone equally, right? We care more about some people than others. And so he said if we wanted to write down a social welfare function that describes what we actually care about, we should put a weight on each individual, a Pareto weight. So we'd say our social welfare is going to be the weight that we place on your well-being times your utility, plus the weight that we put on Maud's well-being times her utility. And if we drew our iceberg box, right, and we drew our contract curve, he said any given point on this contract curve is going to correspond to a different weight that we place on you relative to Maud, right? So if some omnipotent social planner cared a lot more about Maud than you, we'd end up somewhere like this. If they cared a lot more about you than mod, we'd end up somewhere like that. And he said if we want to describe what really happens in the real world, we need this augmentation. Okay. Okay, so that's utilitarianism, right? It makes a lot of deep intuitive sense in a big picture way, right? Essentially what we're saying is that the welfare of a society is just the sum of the welfare of all of the society's members. But if we try to actually use at least old school utilitarian philosophy to make any real decisions, we run into this problem of having to evaluate one person's subjective experience of the world against another's, right? We have to ask how my experience of heartbreak compares to your experience of eating an ice cream cone. And that's something that we really might not feel comfortable doing. So there's an alternative that was formulated by an American political philosopher named John Rawls in a book he called A Theory of Social Justice. And this is, it's big. There's a lot to it that I'm not going to get to today. But the basic idea of his philosophy is, instead of trying to think about, right, how we can add up everyone's welfare, why don't we try to think about what an ideal society is by asking what kind of society we would want to live in if we didn't get to know ahead of time who we were going to be. In other words, if we had to choose our society behind what he called a veil of ignorance. And the catch here is, if you are behind this veil of ignorance, right, you're dropped into a particular person's life, say in the United States of America, you're not only going to have their material circumstances, you're also going to have all of their preferences, all of their beliefs, all of their feelings and experiences, right? Their idiosyncratic goals. So we're not going to put any one person's conception of what's good or right above another's, because we're going to say, if you decide to choose America, you're just as likely, right? You have a 1 in 350 million chance of being Jeff Bezos. You have a 1 in 350 million chance of being a specific homeless person in Los Angeles. You have a 1 in 350 million chance of being a specific person in rural Iowa. So he said, if we were trying to design a society, right, if we were thinking about what would matter to us, if we didn't get to know who we were going to be until after we've chosen a society, right, after we've entered a society, essentially what we would want is we would want to extend the ability to determine your own life circumstances as much as possible to everyone. So he said, each person should have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. In other words, whenever we have the ability to give everyone some freedom of action, some scope under which they can make their own choices, we should do so. And that we should only tolerate social and economic inequalities when they work to the benefit of the least advantaged person in society, and when they're attached to offices and positions open to all and under conditions of fair equality and opportunity. In other words, we should extend as much liberty, freedom, and scope of action to everyone as possible, and we should only tolerate inequality when those inequalities help even the worst off person in society. So if we ask, should we have a society with billionaires? The answer might be yes, right? We might say that the ability to make vast wealth might motivate people to take huge risks or spend lots of their time working monomaniacally on a project. But we should evaluate whether that's a good thing or not, right? Whether inequality is a good thing by whether the person who's helped the least by it is still willing to accept that it's a good and useful thing. So this is a very, very deep and rich and complicated philosophy that at its core rebels against the very idea of writing down a social welfare function mathematically. But we're economists, so we do it anyway. It's in all the textbooks. If you look at any of the textbooks, it'll tell you that a Rawlsian social welfare function is equal to the minimum of your utility and mod's utility. In other words, right, we're not capturing here the idea that we're not going to write down objective utility functions. We still need objective utility functions here. But we are capturing this idea that the society that we should choose, right, social welfare, is based on the well-being of the worst off amongst us, right? So we should have no tolerance whatsoever for inequality unless that inequality helps the person who's worst off. Okay, so this finally leads us to what we call the second welfare theorem, which asks the question, given that there's these various conceptions of social welfare, right? These various answers to the question, how do I evaluate the importance of my well-being relative to your well-being? Can we know whether any of these conceptions are going to align with what happens in a competitive market equilibrium? And the answer to the second welfare theorem is actually yes, subject to a particular circumstance. The argument of the second welfare theorem is we can get an outcome that corresponds to any relative value of different individuals' well-being. Right? If we think about this Pareto adjusted utility function, where we have social welfare equal to the weight we put on your well-being times your utility, plus the weight we put on Maud's well-being times Maud's utility, so on and so forth, we can find a market equilibrium that corresponds to any of these senses of well-being by adjusting the allocation of inputs across the two individuals. In other words, if we think about our Edgeworth box, just our exchange economy, right? We have some contract curve. Some utility, some difference curves, right? What the second welfare theorem tells us is we could get to any point on our contract curve, any of these options, and thus correspond to any of the concepts we could write down of social welfare, as long as it's consistent with liking everyone, caring about everyone at least a little bit, by changing the way that we allocate initial endowments. So if we wanted this outcome here, let's call this outcome A, we could have an endowment like this, right? In a competitive market equilibrium, we would end up somewhere like this. If I wanted to help Maud, right? If I cared more about Maud and less about myself, or less about you, I could get some new endowment like B. And again, find a competitive equilibrium consistent with caring more about Maud and less about you. So what this is really saying, right? What this is fundamentally saying is, if the problem we want to solve in society is inequality, we can do so without disrupting the efficiency generating processes of a competitive economy, as long as we go about solving inequality in the way that does the least to manipulate prices. So in an ideal world, what this would mean is, if we thought that Jeff Bezos has too much and homeless people in Los Angeles have too little, what we would want to do is we would want to go to Jeff Bezos and take a big chunk of the stuff that he owns without having any effect on his wage rate or returns to capital or anything like this, right? We wouldn't want to tax him some percentage of his income. We would want to just show up and take half of his stuff. Ideally, right, because if we did that, it would then distort other people's incentives to become entrepreneurs and start companies like Amazon. Ideally, we'd want to predict that this particular baby is going to turn into Jeff Bezos, show up when he's a baby, measure his IQ, look at his, his family circumstances, etc., and say, I think you're going to be worth $70 billion or $100 billion, whatever it is. So you owe society $58 billion, right? You're going to have to make it at some point because you got to pay it back. That's obviously unrealistic, right? Doing this, what we call lump sum taxation, is very rarely possible in the real world. But the second welfare theorem tells us when we're trying to address inequality through taxation, through redistribution from one individual to another, we should do so in the way that has the least effect on any individual's choices, right? So we should think about how we're affecting people's incentives to work, incentives to save, incentives to live in different kinds of housing, and distort those as little as possible. So for example, if we were deciding whether to tax income or to, say, directly reallocate food and housing to different individuals, or limit the maximum size anyone's apartment could be. The second welfare theorem would say an income tax is better than limiting the size that someone's apartment could be. Okay, so I'm going to officially end our lecture on this note. Thank you so much for bearing with me. If you're desperate for more welfare theorem content, I'm going to make a couple of optional videos where I'm going to talk through some of the implications of the welfare theorems on how we can think about kind of political philosophy, these large-scale questions about how our society should be organized, and also maybe how we can think about our own role in society and our own personal morality. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned. And if not, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all this.